Explosions rocked the small bunker, causing Sergeant Caden of the Union Army to shift slightly. It wasn't that he was afraid. It was kind of hard to be afraid while wearing the equivalent of an infantry fighting vehicle's worth of heavy-powered armor. He was nervous. He always got nervous before an operation, especially since the last failed raid on the rebel supply lines a few days ago. They hadn't lost anyone, thank luck, but his whole squad had been embarrassed by their failure. Caden was wearing a set of Mark III Demolisher-powered armor, the heavy plates full of protective systems and augmenting synthetic muscle fibers that gave him the ability to move with such weight. The armor itself weighed more than 800 kilograms, unloaded with ordnance, far too much for him to have possibly moved without the assistance of the synth muscle fibers that made up the suit's underlayer. Caden turned to his second-in-command, Corporal Ixie. The tall Nerevith woman was wearing her species equivalent of heavy assault armor, a set of Mark III placard armor. It was similar in design to his own, with thick armor plates over a synth muscle undersuit. But that's where the similarities ended. Where his suit was simplistic in design, hers was sculpted and smooth. Where his was rugged, her armor had flair. A distinct difference in their two people's fundamental cultures. Whereas humanity had always excelled at war through the application of pure brute force, her own people had always seen war as more of a dance. Those that got good at the dance became death incarnate, while the less experienced fell like wheat to the scythe. He smiled inside his helmet at the thought of her dancing. The Nerevith were a female-dominant society, making their taller and longer-horned females very direct with their emotions. With their tendency to dance for potential partners, a Nerevith dance meant more than a simple gesture. Putting thoughts of his best friend out of mind, he turned towards the station watch commander, a small Slavith man named Grulrin by his name tapes. The Slavith were an interesting species, partially aquatic. They possessed both gills and lungs, though their lungs remained underdeveloped till they reached sexual maturity in their late teen years. The short-scaled man motioned for Caden to come closer and then slapped a webbed hand down on his small holotable. "We need to push the bastards back over the western trenches," he said a bit vehemently. "The rebels have infiltrated that entire region in force, but they were unable to sneak heavy weapons or armor over no man's land. There is no way they could have carried any kind of heavy ordnance through that quagmire," he said confidently. He would have been surprised if they had even tried. Grulrin nodded his frilled head, his pupilless black eyes fixing on the bright blue glow of Caden's helmet eyeslits. "Then I am depending on your squad to clear them out. If we lose the west, then the deep-cursed rebels will have a direct run on our artillery park. Those monsoon SPAs have almost no ground defense after yesterday's shelling, and I don't think I have to tell you what happens to us all if we lose artillery support," the man said menacingly. He didn't. This entire war had devolved into a stalemate, only punctuated by desperate rushing attacks and the constant fall of heavy munitions. The near-constant artillery duel had been ongoing for more than 8 months. Caden was tired and a little apprehensive. He had a hard time imagining what the regulars were going through. As a member of the Union's more elite forces, Caden and his platoon were ground-pounders, a more highly trained section of the Union's armed forces that used powered armor exclusively, generally to great effect. It had been a tough few months, however, as the unrelenting stalemate had stretched both logistics and manpower to their limits. He thought about the war itself. It had been almost 6 years since the hegemony of Independent Systems Rebellion had started with the unprovoked attack on Sector Eta. Millions of sapient Congressional Union troops and their families dead in a few hours in what had become known as the worst surprise attack in the Union's long history. Worse than the terroristic attacks of the Dustworld's rebellion by an order of magnitude. He nodded after what must have seemed to the station commander to be a short pause. "Understood, Commander. I will take my squad there directly along the abandoned trenches to save time. They should be clear of hostiles by now." Grulrin just waved him away and turned to his aide, his attention now focused on some other crisis. She gave him an affirmative noise and turned away, her tall and slightly leaner form having to duck to make it under the bunker's low doorframe. He followed her and looked around. The bunker was situated in a wide section of the trench works, the ground covered in wooden ties and metal plates so that heavy vehicles could traverse them without getting stuck in the mud. He sighed. The war had taken him from his home on Dryvan 2 across the Union and then back again. This new invasion of his homeworld was the second desperate attack by a foe that knew they couldn't win and so were trying to burn it all down. Dryvan was a major military armament supplier to the Union's military, and the hegemony knew that. Thus the siege had begun as a heavy kinetic bombardment. Once it was clear that they had failed to destroy the planet from orbit, the enemy had landed millions of troops on the planet. This invasion swept over part of the world, taking an entire hemisphere before it was slowed and then finally stopped. By the time the Union had sent a task force large enough to deal with the problem, it was too late. The enemy had dug themselves in like a cancer, setting up anti-ship defenses and 1,000,000 miles of heavily defended trenches. They made it clear that they were here to stay. What was worse in his mind was that not all of the towns they had taken had resisted. There was a not insignificant amount of hegemony support on Dryvan 2 that had facilitated the invasion's overall success. Kaidan's blood boiled at the thought of those traitors calling themselves Dravanians. They weren't fit to live on the planet. They had betrayed their own for what? A misguided notion of control. He shook his head and stalked to his squad. His heavy footfalls thudded along the metal plates underfoot. After a moment, he got close enough to pick up on the ultra-shortwave transmission IXI was broadcasting. And then we will move along to the hot zone. Once there, we will engage and destroy the enemy with extreme prejudice. Any questions? She said, her slightly husky tenor voice filled with calm. Hearing him, or perhaps feeling the weight of his footsteps approaching, IXI turned and motioned to him. Here he is now. Sergeant, any additional words you would like to add before we move out? She asked him. He shook his head and said, No, I trust everyone has their weapons charged and ready. Cooper, I'm looking at you, he said to one of his squad. Before Kaidan could say anything more, a female voice spoke up. The figure it came from was large, even in comparison to Kaidan's power-armored form. It was Draf, the Yone woman big even for her species. Her slightly hunched and werewolf-esque form intimidating in her Mark I tactical assault armor. The bestial-faced helmet designed to strike fear in the hearts of her enemies, and the deep red glow of her suit's eyes, making it look as if it was coated in blood. Well, red blood at least. She spoke, her voice deep and rough. Cooper didn't forget, I made sure of that. She chuckled as Copper grumbled something under his breath. Kaidan shook his head. It was a well-known secret that the two were lovers, though how the man was able to hold his own against the huge, muscled alien was a hotly debated subject. Again he was forced to clear his mind and get himself back on track. A lack of decent sleep and few good meals had been making him feel as though he was being pulled apart slowly. But he was a ground-pounder, one of the toughest motherfuckers the Union had the misfortune of training. He wouldn't let a little thing like deep emotional trauma and near-crippling fatigue keep him from completing his mission. Kaidan stood as tall as he could and commanded, Okay, enough fooling around, form up and move out. IXI, take point 2, we will follow the plan. She nodded her horned head, the purple glow of her helmet's eyes giving nothing away. Immediately after he finished talking, half of his squad moved to stand behind him while the other fell in line behind IXI. Kaidan started off towards the contested area, moving at a steady 15 kilometers per hour on the wide roadway of the supply and command trenches. They made good time. Soon they had to slow, however, as the trenches started to narrow and the ground became first wooden boards and then hard-packed earth. Soldiers in dark blue fatigues moved out of their way as they rushed by, the men and women looking just as tired and worn as he felt inside. This war was taking a heavy toll on both the defenders and the defended civilians further to the rear. He swore silently as he thought of the selfish actions that had led to this point. Screw the rebels for starting this war, and screw the Union bureaucrats for not seeing this coming. The entire rebellion could have been avoided if the policymakers of the central government had just paid more attention to the frontier world's needs. He had to jump suddenly as he rounded a corner, and several soldiers were blocking the path with a large wheelbarrow of loose soil. He cleared the cart easily and landed on the ground with a solid thump that left 2 small craters in the hard soil. He sent a small obstruction warning to the troops behind him with the flick of his eyes, and a muttered word. The internal helmet display of his armor giving him fine control over its systems without much effort. He spared a glance to make sure none of the others had been slowed, and was happy to see that they had all in fact gotten his warning, either jumping over the obstruction like he had, or dodging around it, using the fast twitch synth muscles of their armor. He continued on, taking a myriad of turns in the twisting labyrinth of the trench networks. Almost as if a switch had been thrown, he took another turn, and the atmosphere changed instantly. These trenches were unlit and unoccupied, their earthen walls crumbling, and the swill of neglect pooling in their acrid bases. A short distance travelled along these derelict channels, and the unmistakable sounds of combat reached his suit's active sensors. He held up a hand in the reduce speed command and slowed. While he was protected in his heavy armor, only a fool would barge directly into unknown turmoil without at least trying to scope out the situation. He motioned for Ixi to move up alongside him. They were operating on direct connection comms, where they had to be in physical contact with each other to speak. It worked by sending a small electrical signal through the gauntlet, which was picked up and translated by the other's suit. It was their in-combat version of whispering, while maintaining radio silence. She nodded before walking towards Cooper. Cooper was their recon trooper. His Mark I blackout armor was the newest design in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. While its armor was not nearly as heavy as his or the others, it was more than adequate for the kinds of small arms fights they most commonly participated in. It's not like they were wearing super-heavy battle plate and could go toe-to-toe with armored vehicles. Caden frowned. He had always wanted to try piloting one of those behemoth suits. The latest versions weighed well in excess of 1.5 tons and could shatter buildings with their hands. His train of thought was cut short by the sound of a small object whizzing by him. It was Cooper's peeper, the small surveillance drone designed for stealth. It had noise-cancelling toroidal blades and electromagnetic reflectant skin to hide from radar and thermal. Cooper piloted the small device via a virtual joystick and his eyes. Accessing the feed via a direct laser link, Caden saw a small feed pop up in the corner of his vision. It showed the abandoned trenches zipping by at high speed. The drone was piloted through a combination of passive communication and intermittent active pings that allowed the man to pilot it remotely without drawing much attention. After another moment, the drone popped up into the open air and uncovered the full scale of the attack. Dozens of entrenched defenders on the Union side were being rushed down by what had to be several hundred rebel troops. The old saying of 3-to-1 defense came to mind. It looked as if the defenders were outnumbered almost 5-to-1 here. They would surely begin to fail in the next few minutes without intervention. For while many tens of attackers lay dead or dying in the toxic mud, the defenders were beginning to fall a few at a time. Switching to ultra-shortwave comms, Caden said, "Okay, we are moving in. No obvious heavy weapons from the rebels, but that doesn't mean they aren't hiding them specifically in case of armored assault. So I want you all to be careful and pay attention. Cooper, put your peeper on standby or passive overwatch. We move out in 10 seconds. He took a deep breath, the blood rushing in his veins as the adrenaline started to course through them. It was humanity's unique curse, the effects of the natural combat stimulant both helping and hindering his performance in battle. On one hand, it heightened his senses and made him stronger and faster. On the other hand, it narrowed his emotional and rational fields of view, making violence appear as the only option when quick thinking and wit might have been better served. That's why he was so grateful for Ixi, the Nerevith being wired completely opposite of humans. Where he ran hot-headed in battle, prone to force and instinctive action, she was cool-headed and more likely to spot minor exploitable gaps in her enemy's defenses. The Nerevith's natural inclination for battle, making them peerless warriors and point-to-point tacticians. A human might have a better grasp of the war or battle as a whole, but a Nerevith would almost always outwit a battle-enraged human in personal combat. His eyes opened as the 10 seconds ran out. Without a word, he threw his arm forwards in the universal signal to advance and charge towards the enemy. There was no wind in his hair and no mud in his eyes as he charged, his suit isolating him strangely from the more visceral feel of combat. It was a strange way to wage war, contained in a prison of numbness. His body registered his movements, but he didn't feel anything. Not the hard, cracked dirt under his heavy armored boots, not the chill, noxious wind in the air, nor the sounds of battle up ahead. His suit registered them all, however, and did its best to mirror the information to him, but it was obviously artificial. He hadn't always fought this way. Once upon a time he had been a raw-faced recruit, a mere private in a vast military that didn't care about his existence. There had been no war then, no galactic-scale conflict. The most intrusive actions in his daily routine was PT and the constant psych evaluations. He had fought pirates and brigands, protecting the commerce that kept the vast Union alive. Several times he had even had to fight against flesh-tearers, the monstrous cannibals that preyed on unprotected shipping lanes. This was different. There was no downtime, no breaks. Just days, weeks, months of grinding, unremitting warfare, blatant in its cruelty and savage in its nature. He had grown to hate himself for enjoying it, but part of him knew this was what he had been born to do. He was a killer, always had been, always had. These thoughts crossed his mind as he burst through a weakened section of trench right behind a pair of rebel soldiers. He pulled up his M2 Mk-12, the heavy machine gun far too bulky for a soldier to wield, unless they were wearing powered armor. The rebel soldier on the left, a tall Nerevith female in light armor, has just enough time to notice him before he squeezed the trigger of his huge gun. The bright staccato flash lit the carnage like pictures from an old-fashioned holoplay. The two rebels were ripped apart by the force of the massive bullets as they tore through their fragile bodies. He stopped firing, as it was clearly apparent the two wouldn't be getting back up. He walked over the corpses, bones cracking beneath his heavy tread as he scanned the trench for more targets. A small cutout of the trench in front of him lit up as something fired on him. He didn't even feel the impacts of the bullets against his heavy armor. Instead, he simply returned fire, aiming slightly to the side of the trench, trusting that his weapon would cut through the intervening earth. He shook his head and paused for a status check. Sending out an active ping, he received a full 9 green pings across the board. He smiled. That meant that his squad was still in good condition after first contact. Leaving the status board in the corner of his display, he moved along the trench, making sure to keep a watchful eye for potential movements. He looked up sharply as a spray of purple lines seared across the darkened sky. The lines so bright they left slight after images that persisted for several seconds even as he looked away. That would likely have been Ixie firing off her tri-beamer combiner, the heavy near-ultraviolet laser weapon more than capable of punching through light armor at close ranges. He continued walking for another few steps before something sailed through the air and landed at his feet. He had just enough time to realize it was a fragmentation grenade before it exploded with a tremendous bang. Withering hails of shrapnel slashed against the thick Titan steel duramite layered armor he wore. With a muted grunt, he was knocked back a step, his armor straining to keep him upright. He only had time to fire a short burst that smashed the leftmost rebel from her feet before they were upon him. He heard the impacts of weapons and some point-blank fire. He needed to clear some space before one of them swung a shiver steel blade or voltaic bayonet into the gaps of his armor. Even the aggregated hyperdiamond bucky weave of his undersuit would not protect him from such close-range attack, so he chose the best option he could think of. He simply swung the heavy barrel of his gun in an arc, knocking 3 of the rebels to the ground and sending the 4th into the side wall with bone-shattering force. 3 of them scrambled back to their feet. 1 didn't. Caden quickly slung his gun back to his side, the heavy plasteel chains holding it in place snugly. He reached down and drew his close-range weapon, a heavy thermomass. The flanged, armor-piercing head quickly began to glow orange as he thumbed the activation switch, and he lashed out at one of the rebels with it, smashing their arm. The rebel he had struck spun away with a scream as their smoldering arm hung limply from their shoulder, the wound instantly cauterized. Turning to the other two, he noticed they had drawn close-range weapons of their own. The tall human on the right, wearing medium combat armor, had drawn a heavy voltic power sword, electrical arcs dancing along its length and ionizing the surrounding air, giving the weapon an ominous purple glow. The other, a large Yone female in heavy armor, had drawn a chain-toothed axe of enormous proportions from her back. It looked more suited to cutting down entire forests than combat, but she held it in her muscular arms like it was a toy. Caden took a step back, analyzing the situation in moments. He smiled slightly as the familiar rush of adrenaline began to course through his blood. He was about to rush them when another sound drew his attention and caused him to freeze. From behind him, he heard the unmistakable angry hum of a shiver steel weapon being activated. Turning his head slightly and allowing his peripheral cameras to pick up his rear, he cursed. The man he had wounded had popped an adrenaline spike and drawn a vibrosaber. The weapon vibrating at such a high frequency, it seemed to turn incorporeal, the sword looking like a ghostly mirage in the man's remaining hand. This had just gotten more dangerous. The two in front alone he could have dispatched easily, but surrounded and with almost no room to maneuver, he would be hard-pressed to win this fight unscathed. But he was a Union soldier. Caden squared his shoulders at the thought and raised his now white-hot thermometer into a defensive position. He wouldn't go down without a fight. Each weapon of choice had its own strengths and weaknesses. His thermometer would cause pain and minor burns from even a near miss, its surface temperature nearly 4,000 degrees Celsius. Direct strikes on armor plates would damage them, but his weapon's effect was vastly decreased against armored targets. The Yaun's chain-tooth axe would be devastating to him, however. It was equipped with T-BAM cutting teeth, the material almost infinitely harder than his powered armor's tungsten alloy. If struck, he could expect the brutal weapon to take chunks out of his protective plates, maybe even dig deep enough to damage the synth muscle fiber bundles beneath. The resultant loss of mobility to his heavy suit would leave him incredibly vulnerable, so he needed to avoid the weapon at all costs. The voltaic power sword and vibrosaber were dangerous to unarmored targets, but less effective against his thick carapace. With this in mind, he struck out quickly, swinging his long-handled mace in a terrible overhand swing directly at the Yaun's great furred head. To his dismay, she seemed to have expected his attack and leapt back out of harm's way. His mace smashed into the side wall of the tunnel and stuck, smoke billowing from the quickly atomized mud. He jerked in surprise as the tall man slashed his exposed side with his power sword, the electrified blade carving a small furrow in his side plate and discharging a tremendous amount of current into the powered armor as well. His systems were temporarily dazzled by the sudden burst of raw electricity, and he lashed out in a bland panic. His mace made slight contact with something, and he heard a muffled scream of pain. He put his back to the wall and shook his head, mace up in a guard position. His vision cleared, the static of the attack disappearing as his suit compensated for the charge. He took stock of the situation and noticed the vibrosaber slashing towards his throat almost too late. He brought up his forearm in a desperate block, and the weapon skated off his rounded vambrace, taking several flakes of his armor with it. The man had tucked his useless arm into his flak jacket and tied it off. A veteran, it seemed. There was a momentary lull as the three attackers sized him up. The tall man held his side. Smoke curling from his exposed trench coat made Caden smile. It seemed the man had not gotten away from his attack scot-free either. Caden grinned under his helmet and activated his external speakers. "You should give up now. Lay down your arms and surrender. I respect your strength and will abide by the code of war, allowing no harm to befall surrendered combatants," he said, not expecting them to comply. The tall man looked at his buddy and they grinned. The one-armed man brandished his saber and replied, "Never to you, you thrice-beaten son of a Union dog. I would rather eat my own arm than surrender to the likes of you, a coward and a traitor to the people." The Yone woman growled deep and loud at the remark, nodding her pointed-eared head and giving Caden a savage, predatory grin as the man finished speaking. She added, "Yes, and you are the one who should be surrendering. We have scored blood on both sides. Your honor is met." If you surrender now, you may just live to see the morrow. Or don't, it makes little difference to me. Though I do tire of killing the Union's whipped kids, give me a foe worthy of my time. She finished with another growl. The trench was narrow and the night was dark, the lights of starburst flares being the main source of guttering light that lit the scene in front of him. Caden took a step forwards, his thermometers glowing bright enough to light the trench like dusk. In response, the three hegemony soldiers shifted as well, matching him step for step, as he once more took a position in the center of the earthenworks. This time, however, the tall man was behind him, the one-armed man and the young female in front. She revved her chain-toothed axe menacingly and raised it high, a challenge to the world and a threat for him. He just raised his own weapon in response. For a few seconds they remained that way, each one waiting for the other to move first. Then, like lightning, the one-armed man lashed out in a straight lunge towards his exposed gut. Caden dodged to the side, the vibrosaber missing his middle by centimeters. In response, he swung a powerful downward attack that clipped the man's sword and sent him spiraling away into the side of the trench. The attack stunned the man, but was the opening move for the other two. The tall man slashed at Caden's back, while the Yon made an upwards cut towards his groin, with the intent to split him in half. He had to dodge backwards and to the side, the chain axe's teeth biting into his upper thigh instead. The cut was shallow but wide, stripping the outer layer of his cuisses off and exposing the layered duramite beneath. He grunted as the heavy contact bruised his leg inside the armor and stumbled slightly. This lapse in defense was enough for the tall man to stab him in the side, the Voltic power sword burning through the underlayer of his armor and digging into his side. Caden slapped the embedded sword away with a gasp of pain, the electrified weapon causing his muscles to freeze in agony for a moment before the weapon was withdrawn. He fell to one knee and swung his mace in an undisciplined and frantic arc at knee level. He was only partially successful as the weapon tore the tall man's left leg's armor off, burning him in the process. The man cursed loudly and hopped back, his knee smoking and the exposed flesh underneath an angry red in color. Sucking in a deep breath, Caden climbed back to his feet. He quickly instructed his armor to inject him with local anesthetic near the site of injury, and gave a sigh as the intense pain faded away like snow on a summer's day. Shaking his head to clear it, he noticed that the one-armed man had recovered. His sword had been shattered, though, and he was holding a telescoping blade now. The weapon was much less dangerous than his original vibrosaber, but could still be deadly if used correctly. It would be folly to underestimate the man simply because his weapon was less dangerous. Pride would be his downfall more so than anything else, he realized. He had to stop fighting defensively or they would cut him apart, piece by piece. Letting loose a bass roar, he lunged at the one-armed man whose eyes widened in sudden surprise. Not even raising his weapon, Caden's shoulder charged the man with the entire force of his heavy armor. Like a pain train of rage, he smashed the man into the wall of the trench. The shattering of bone was so loud it made Caden flinch, but he didn't hesitate. Turning his bloodied form towards the tall man, he gave another shout and charged in a similar manner. But instead of following through, he executed a combat roll at the last minute. Dodging to the left, he narrowly avoided taking the huge chain axe in the back, while also putting himself in the perfect position to strike the tall man's unprotected side. He lashed out in an overhand swing that connected his white, hot-flanged mace with the unarmored part of the tall man's side. A sickening crunch issued from the impact as half of the man's ribcage was smashed in, rupturing the man's heart instantly. The man dropped without a noise, his lungs crushed and his smouldering ruin thrashing in abject agony. He grunted in effort as he threw her back, the fur on her arms smoking as it curled from the heat of his mace. She kneeled for a second before looking up at him and growling, "You killed my packmates. For this I will tear you limb from limb, metal man. I will dig you from that armor as a vrynth digs a snidge from its ear." The large woman snarled, her reflective green predator's eyes flashing in the light of his weapon. She steamed in rage and charged him. Ixie's words echoed through his mind, "Be calm, don't let the anger take over." Taking a breath and holding it, he dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the huge alien's charge. Her wildly whirring chain axe bit deep into the ground. Sparks flew as the teeth chewed through wood, dirt, and stone with equal ease. Yanking the screaming weapon free, she turned to face him, a line of drool falling from her snarling lips. He let out the breath and crouched. He needed to be careful. The T-bam teeth of her chain-toothed axe would easily shred through the handle of his weapon. He couldn't block her again, only get out of her way. He dodged her again, this time receiving a series of scratches on his pauldron for his trouble. He needed to unbalance her, get her to make a mistake. A thought entered his head and he grimaced. It was a grisly idea, but would no doubt be effective. He took a few steps back towards the corpse of the tall man, all while keeping an eye on the enraged Yaun. She followed his every moment with her bright eyes, the nature of an ambush predator keeping her attuned to him in a way he could not match. He took a final step back and felt something shift next to him. It was the cooling corpse of the tall man, his face frozen in a look of torment. He turned to the woman and asked in a casual manner, "Oh, what's this? I seem to have stepped in some dog shit. Better wipe it off my boots." And he made a motion of wiping his armored boot on the dead man's pants. Kaidan only had time to realize that she had discarded her weapon before the large alien slammed into him with enough force to send the mace flying from his hand and knock him down onto his back. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him and his vision a little grey. It took him a second to realize that the Yaun was sitting on his armored chest, straddling him and pinning his arms to his sides with her legs. He tried to move but found he didn't have the leverage to break free. He squirmed, but to no avail. The damage done to his armor was weakening him to the point he couldn't throw the big Yaun off. She smiled widely, her face splitting in a predatory smile, rows of sharp, tearing teeth on display as she rested her hands on his shoulders. She leaned down close to his face and whispered loud enough for him to hear, "Oh, I'm going to enjoy carving you out of this suit piece by piece." Kaidan swore loudly, and the woman just laughed evilly. "This is what you get, little man," she said as she produced a diamonomolecular knife from her thigh. He gasped in pain as she twisted the helmet violently and wrenched it off his head. Blinking several times as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he felt hot breath on his face. The woman took a deep sniff and chuckled. "I can smell the fear radiating off of you, pathetic. You are just like the rest of them, cowards, packbreakers, not worthy of a warrior's death." He flinched away from her hand as she extended her claws. She put a finger behind one of his ears, and then with a quick motion took a notch out of it. Kaidan jerked and swore, "Shit, okay, you got me, you fuzzer. Just kill me and be done with it. This toying is sadistic." She shook her head and ran a hand through his hair almost tenderly. "No, this is nothing. You will beg me for death much harder than that before I'm done with you." He jerked and struggled more, but again found that he was helplessly pinned. Just before she had torn his helmet off, he had tried to send a distress pulse, but without his helmet's heads-up display, he had no idea if he had been successful or not. He sighed internally as he tried to ignore the blood running from his ear. It either had and he would be saved, or it hadn't, in which case he was looking at a very unfortunate evening. The woman dragged her blade down his chest, scouring a thin line down the tungsten alloy plates. As she reached his belly, she stopped and started to dig the knife under the heavy chest plate before she froze. She whipped around and started to stand when a brilliant purple light stabbed completely through her head. The now very dead Yaun dropped like a discarded puppet and slumped across his chest. He struggled to extricate himself from the body as he heard heavy footsteps approaching. He had a feeling it was friendly, but it never hurt to be careful. Rolling to the side, he scooped up his M2 and pointed the barrel down the trench towards the direction of the beam. The light turned off as he said it, and a tall, power-armored figure walked up to him carrying an impressive-looking weapon. Ixie's voice issued through the suit's external speakers, and she asked, "What is this, Kaidan? I leave you on your own for 5 minutes and you almost get yourself tortured to death. What would command say if they saw the great Sergeant Kaidan now, destitute and defiled by a hegemony whore?" she asked him with a chuckle. He frowned and said, "That's not funny. I got 4 of them, the last one caught me by surprise." Ixie extended a hand towards him, and he took it gratefully, groaning in pain as he rose to his feet. He shifted uncomfortably and announced, "I have multiple stab wounds and at least 2 fractured ribs. One might be broken entirely." He finished. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, as her face was covered behind the helmet she was wearing, but he got the impression she was grinning at him. She just gestured to the dead Yon and giggled, "Now you know what Cooper feels like, I'll bet." Kaiden shook his head and protested, "No, that's not funny, take that back." She shook her helmeted head and told him, "It's going to cost you. Now what could you offer me that might keep my mouth shut?" He threw his hands up and hefted his gun. "I have no idea what psychos like you enjoy. You keep your secrets. I'm tired and hurting. How are we doing?" He asked her in a more serious manner. He asked her, "So Malconet was injured too? Shot in the chest by an RPL 5.6, he should be okay. Though that thermal damage is going to fuck up his scales. Okay, it looks like we're pretty much done here. Aside from a few minor injuries, we are all fit for travel." Ixie walked a few more steps before pausing. "What did that reverse Egdesiast say to you?" He chuckled at her chosen description of the rebel soldier and shook his head. "Oh, the usual. She was going to chop me up. Make it a slow and painful death, nothing too disturbing." He paused and then turned to face her. Lowering his tone, he said, Thanks for saving me, Ixie. I would have been a peeled frubble if you hadn't shown up when you did. I do owe you a special thanks, but we'll talk about it later. For now, let's just get this wrapped up and head back to base for some rest." Ixie walked over and slapped his shoulder, saying, "Anytime, Kaiden, anytime. Now I believe we have a few more rebels to flush out. Maybe they will be sporting and put up a little bit of a fight this time, eh?" she said as she nudged him. He nodded and smiled. If only they put up less of a fight, he thought to himself. As she walked away, he said, "Okay, I have a few ideas that might be to your liking." He saw her helmet turn slightly as she asked, "Oh, and what might those be?" If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.